what is it like sitting across from a remorseless killer? What is that feeling like?
We've interviewed more than 5,000 inmates in the last 20 years. And they're quite jovial, they're fun, they're charismatic, they have a charm to them. You enjoy talking to them. Clinically, they're fascinating. I'll put up an equation, one of Einstein's field equations for the theory of general relativity, and I'll tell people, here, you want to know how a psychopath feels when you ask them, do they feel bad for what they did? And I put up this equation, I go, solve this. And people just stare at it blankly, right? You look at it blankly and you're like, I have no idea even where to start. Right. Well, that's how they...
such a good example. That's such a good...
They don't feel...
complete befuddlement. That's, yeah.
Yeah. And I said, that's how they feel when you ask them about empathy. They don't have that skill.
Dr. Ken Kiehl is a neuroscientist and clinical psychologist whose work has redefined how we understand psychopathy. He literally put an MRI in a semi-truck and drove it into prisons, building the world's largest inmate brain database, 5,000 scans across 50 prison facilities, to map the neural circuitry of conscience, impulse, and violence. He's the author of The Psychopath Whisperer, the best-selling inside story of what the remorseless brain looks and feels like. Subscribe if you want your anterior cingulate to hit the brakes before your amygdala absolutely floors it.
We have a mobile MRI that actually is in a trailer, a semi-trailer. We've been using it for 20 years now. Been to probably 50 prisons in 10 states. You know, we've studied now more than 5,000 inmates.
Wow.
We followed up 500 boys in the juvie Supermax in New Mexico, and 88% of them are back in prison. What that suggests is that there really wasn't anything meaningfully done with them while they were in juvie to try to curb them from maintaining this high-risk trajectory. Really, the main motivation behind working and studying and trying to understand these guys is so that we can develop a way of treating them, so that we could treat them in such a way that we could remediate or stop these things from happening. I'll talk about the best treatment program that we know that's out there that actually has made some pretty good inroads in doing this.
Dr. Ken Kiehl, just how many psychopaths have you interviewed?
Wow, it'd be a couple hundred at least. I spent the first, kind of in my beginning of my academic career as a graduate student, I was working in a Supermax facility in Canada. They were bringing 20 to 30 new high-risk offenders every 3 months to the facility for treatment. It was a treatment program, cognitive behavioral therapy program for violent offenders and sex offenders that were about to get released, or in some cases might have just been arrested and they wanted to try to work on treating them before they got into the institution. So they were the highest risk offenders in all of Canada. And so that's similar to saying something like the highest risk in all of California, a similar population. And I was able to, I interviewed all of them. I mean, over about 3 or 4 years. So that kind of kicked it off. And then for, the next 30 years, it's been a while since I graduated. I've done a lot of cases of forensic cases. Lawyers will call and ask, can you help me figure out what's wrong or different? Or, does my client need an MRI to try to understand what happened? Or how might this be relevant to their legal case? And so I've done, maybe 50 or 60 of those cases. And a lot of those cases are either serial killers or spree killers or someone who, in that similar genre. And a lot of those score very high on psychopathy as well. And then, of course, the research program that we do, we've interviewed more than 5,000 inmates, the lab, my whole lab has, in the last 20 years. And of that, about 20% will score in the clinical range. And we often will have those presented in lab meeting or discussions about those cases and the symptoms, the issues, the things that they did, and so lots. So, I mean, if I can try to count all those up, it'd probably be 500 to 1,000, something like that would be the total number.
Wow.
I guess. Yeah. It's a
Just
lot.
insane. Some career you found yourself in, and we'll dive into maybe the
Sure.
different inflection points throughout that brought you here. And I'm curious to go into the Neurolaw stuff as well, because I find that whole area really interesting. But what is it like sitting across from a remorseless killer? Like, what is that feeling like?
Yeah, they present um, most of the time when you're interacting or working with them, they're quite jovial, they're fun, they're charismatic, they have a charm to them. That's one of the symptoms. They present in such a way that um, you enjoy talking to them. Clinically, they're fascinating. It's just amazing, and people have written about this for centuries that they how they can appear on the surface very uh, calm or very nice and friendly and fun, but then when you look at the totality of the things that they've done and the problems and the damage, it's just remarkable given the person that you are talking to right in front of you.
Right.
And so but I think that it's what's really interesting is normally by the time you've reviewed their files, so we always recommend that, you've already done a deep dive into the background of the person before you get in a room with them. Because if you try to go in without any information whatsoever, they'll just stonewall you, or you'll be gaslit the whole time. You won't know you won't get much information out of there. So the more you can be armed with details and things that you can poke at to try to get at how they might respond and how they might behave and how they talk about it and how they feel about it, the better you can assess the traits that we're trying to assess. So, but that being said, sometimes you still get surprised. There'll be things that guys will say that you'll be like, that's a good one, and often there's even a sense of, I've had them compete with one another for who's the best. At that treatment facility, I would go interview guys and have them come down and to my office down in the corner, and we would be chatting from their living quarters. And one of them would be like, so I've heard you've been doing this for a while. You've never met anybody like me. And then they'll just start telling you stuff, and I'll be like, okay, well, surprise me. Let's see what you can do. And then in some cases, they really do. They really will do things or say things that they've done that you would be shocked. And
Wow.
but generally, when you sit down and talk to them, they're talkative. They're engaging. They tell a lot of stories. They like to present themselves in a good way, even if they've done bad things and they're currently incarcerated, or many of them, they're on death row. They're in some form of the criminal justice system that is the last place that you want to end up. And so it's just really fascinating. Like, one guy interviewed in Texas death row, I was asked to help evaluate whether or not his initial trial would have benefited from a brain scan. And in this case, I think it would have, because he had a pretty significant brain injury when he was like 18 years old from a car crash. And that was never evaluated as part of his trials and his mitigation and evidence for the death penalty trial. But when I met him the first time, he was shackled when he came in. They unshackled him. It was a female correctional officer that brought him in, and they were laughing and joking around about stuff. And she just said, yeah, he's just the easiest to get along with. He's never been a problem. He's always funny. And so we like him here, I mean, he killed 3 people, and he raped many, many, many more. He just thought that was fine behavior, but he was fun to talk to. He basically, I spent like the whole morning with him, and then went and got lunch and came back and spent the whole afternoon, and just listening to his stories and getting him to talk about things and trying to understand, not only his personality, having psychopathy, but also how the brain injury might have affected him. And so,
Wow.
yeah, and then we did an MRI scan of his brain, and he was just hilarious and funny and interesting. And sometimes what's really amazing about some of them is, even though they know they're going to get caught at some point, a lot of them just don't even try to escape or go to Mexico or Belize or some some country that you can't be extradited from, or just go hide and he's just asked too much work, and here he is sitting on death row when he could have easily, left. He wasn't being sought yet, but he was simply waiting for the DNA that he had to give as part of one trial into the criminal justice system to get caught up on the 3 prior murders where he left DNA. So he knew they would eventually catch him, and he had a couple of years before they did. And so he even actually confessed when he got arrested for another crime, because he saw that the police officer that was in charge of the first homicide that he committed had been up for, it was like every couple of years they'll do a front page story about it, and this officer is just haunted by this case. And when he was arrested and that officer was in the room, he couldn't help himself but to admit to that killing in front of that officer for the look on his face. And so he said, yeah, I know I did that one too. And the cop just couldn't believe it, and he said, oh, it was worth it. The guy, he'll never forget me. And so it's just
Oh
sometimes
my God.
mind-boggling and baffling how they present and how they, the stories they'll tell you and the things that they've done and the choices they make, which are just sometimes just escape logic, even though they're average to above average IQ. And so it's kind of a long-winded response, but they're in essence um, they're really truly are clinically fascinating to work with.
Yeah.
They present very differently. I have a very large lab, over 30 people, and they all go out to prisons every day, and they're interviewing, talking, and it's simply is kind of one of the most fascinating things when you're able to sit down and interview somebody that scores really high, and kind of all of the stories and all of the books that you've read and all the papers you've read, kind of come to life right there in that personality of that person.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a great answer. Wow. There must be such a disconnect when you're laughing and joking and sitting across from this other human being. And then maybe at times you even forget what was in that file momentarily because they are so good at that manipulation. And I'm actually curious, do you think, do they maintain that lying and manipulation even when in prison after they've been caught, after they've been exposed? Do they maintain that as their personality?
Yeah. Absolutely. It's just a part of their personality. And so they're just going to present that way. And you can, like I said, that's just how they generally present. And, we occasionally will send people in without reading the files, and they'll go me interview somebody that scores high, and they'll come out of the interview and be like, wow, that guy was great. He's so nice. And I really enjoyed it. And I would go have a beer with him if I didn't know any better. And then he'd be like, now go read his file, and then go re-interview him. And so when you go back in armed with all that information, what you find out is that the guy goes, well, I didn't want to tell you about the old me. I just want to talk about the new things and the fun things. And I'm a fun person. And so, let's talk about these things, not those old issues that everyone wants to talk about. So they do present, and that's just true of how they act on the outside as well as on the inside. They're usually, on the inside, they're very, they are one of the more engaging. They're just socially disinhibited. And so they'll go try to make friends with guards. They make friends with other, staff. They'll make friends with other, inmates. They're, you can turn sour in the facilities, in the prisons, if they get into drugs or they get into dealing or they get into other things, it can be dangerous. Or if they, but from an overall perspective, I mean, they're quite, entertaining to be around with. And as long as you're not on their prey list, you're not what they're interested in, then, you can, they're quite manageable in the facilities.
It's a very rational perspective to have, that as long as you're not their particular type of prey, you can rationalize being okay around. I think that might take a couple of psychopath interviews for you to be able to rationalize that and be okay in that scenario. I feel like a lot of people would still be completely shaking.
Again, the other thing to recognize, I think, is that we are not a adversarial, position with them. We are there in a research context, usually, where they are given a unique opportunity to talk to us confidentially. It's like talking to a therapist or a doctor, and they're able to tell us things that will be kept confidential. There are actually, the research records aren't even supposed to be subpoenaable, so they're going to be kept completely confidential, never used in court. And so that's a rare thing for them to have an opportunity to sit down and start telling stories and be free. And it kind of does often really free people up to talk and to talk about their issues, their problems, even because we do a lot of treatment studies. We treat substance use. We do mindfulness based stuff. We have cognitive behavioral therapies we've done. We do a lot of work with the inmates to try to help develop and treat psychopathic traits, as well as treat other, substance use and other types of problems. So trauma history, lots of things that we've done to try to help develop treatment programs and implement them. And so in the context of that, they're often they're they're free to talk to us and tell us everything so that we can help get them the
Right.
right forms of treatment. And so even the high scores, they're more likely than anybody else. Those that score kind of in the very clinical range of psychopathy, they're going to be they just talk a lot. It's just like they can't help themselves. I mean, if you just sit there and give them a pause, they can't tolerate the silence, and so they'll just start talking. Um,
Right.
and it's not really like a pressured speech or anything like that. It really just is that they're there for this purpose, and they're enjoying themselves, and so they're going to go ahead and tell all the stories. And yeah, and so it's I always describe it as just never boring. It's just always fascinating.
I'm
And
sure.
yeah,
Something that always strikes me when I talk to neuroscientists is just how staggeringly complex the brain really is. It's this incredible prediction engine, always trying to make sense of the world and keep us safe. But it's important to remember we're still running ape hardware. Our brains weren't even remotely built for the chaos of modern life, and sometimes they just get scrambled. I've recently had some difficulty in my own personal life, and I realized that it was about time my own ape prediction system got the gym workout and just rebalancing that it's probably needed for quite a long time. So I booked my first therapy session with BetterHelp, who I'm incredibly excited to be partnering with on this video. A massive umbrella review of hundreds of randomized control trials found that nearly every meta-analysis of psychotherapy favored it over control conditions. In other words, mental health professionals from decades of research consistently find that talking therapies do actually work. BetterHelp is an entirely online therapy platform designed to make that process incredibly simple. You can connect with a licensed therapist from your home on your schedule through video, audio, or even text with literally no fuss at all. What I like about it is that you can switch therapists at any time until you find someone who you personally can build rapport with and open up to, which is such a critical part of therapy at no extra cost. If you've ever thought about trying therapy, or you're just feeling a little bit stuck in your own head lately like I was, this might be a great first step that I really couldn't recommend more. Visit betterhelp.com/giantshoulder to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp/giantshoulder, and in doing so you also support the channel. Links are down below, because sometimes the most powerful way to understand your own brain is just to talk about it.
so
When you say high scores, it might be worth just defining, going
yeah.
into some of the background on what a high score is, what a low score is, what exactly this score entails.
Yeah, my graduate advisor, Robert Hare, he developed a test that we use to assess psychopathy or psychopathic traits in forensic facilities. The test is administered by reviewing everything you can about the individual. So there's usually detailed files about the crimes, about their family history, their school history, work history, even if it's sporadic, and then of course all of their criminal history and family, how they've dealt with or worked with family and stuff like that. And so you essentially kind of review all of that information because you're assessing a trait. And so the trait, that means it has to be present at home, at work, at school, in family and friends, in all domains of their life. And it has to be present for the majority of their life. And so you have to see it. It doesn't just magically appear, for a couple of years or something and then disappear. No, it's present from, many people believe you can assess these traits, 10, 11, 12. Certainly
Wow.
in adolescence is very possible, and we do routinely, and then all the way through adulthood. So the traits are, and then you interview them, if at all possible. You do 2-hour, maybe 3-hour interviews sometimes, covering all these different aspects of their life, and that's called the life history interview. And then you're going to go rate them on 20 items. It's called an expert rater device. So you're trained on how to assess these items. Each item ranges from 0, the item does not apply to them at all. It doesn't fit them in any respect. A 1, the item applies to them in many respects, but not to the full level. And then 2, this item definitely applies to this individual. They have it in all aspects of their life and for the majority of their life. And the 20 symptoms are basically things like they're superficial, they're charming, but they don't actually give you a lot of useful information. They tend to be, they're also deceptive, and so I like the word mendacity. It's a term that connotes that they make up stories and tell lies and fibs when there's not even any real reason for doing it. There's no motivation behind it. It's just like they make up these things for fun. Sometimes they're not even aware of it. But it's not quite towards the point of where they're confabulating, like they're really ill and they're making up stuff and new words and all sorts of stuff. And it's not just lying, it's for their own purposes. And so it's right there in this middle piece that's there. So it's called pathological lying. They're also capable of manipulation. And so these are they'll use checks, or they'll do frauds, or they'll do lots of evidence of this. They'll manipulate for financial gain everyone they can interact with at any level. The other central traits that we call them are kind of the lack of empathy, guilt, and remorse. And so they have no concern about what they've done, and they have no ability really to appreciate what they've done. And sometimes they're even outrightly callous about it. They'll be like, the victim's fine. Like, sure, he did 6 months in the hospital, but I got 4 years in prison for that fight, so they'll basically be very callous about the interactions or things that they've had with other people, or they'll be like, the victims will be fine, that kind of stuff. They're often just straightforward about that. They don't have any concern about that. And those are some of the central traits. There's other things. They're irresponsible, meaning that they'll actively look for things that they can take on that give them, whether that's a car loan or a credit card, and they never pay it back. They're got terrible credit scores. That's one thing that we've always wanted to look at as an indicator, because the willingness to engage and take on more things, but never have any real, sense of giving it back. And then there's the behavioral things. So these things start very early. You're normally able to see precocious, antisocial behavior or criminal behavior even by the age of 8 or 9. They'll start to do drugs and other things really early in life. They've been a problem, and people have written about them from 4, 5, 6. They've thought they were different. They don't engage in team sports or anything like that. Usually, those behaviors persist and get worse in adolescence, and so there's always charges or convictions in adolescence for bad behavior. And then one of the other items is if you give them a trusting relationship like parole or probation, they violate immediately. There's just no sense of loyalty or for the process. There's another funny item called criminal versatility, which is their willingness to engage in a wide variety of different types of criminal activities. So they're not just limited to one thing. Like, they're not just the burglar who goes in and steals stuff to support their criminal lifestyle, and they don't do anything else, and they scope and they're careful, etc. That the person has different issues. Individuals with psychopathy or psychopathic traits, they're willing to try any kind of criminal activity. There's just nothing that keeps them back. They're really usually not specialized, although there are exceptions, but they're just willing to kind of do anything. And they're impulsive, they're hot-headed. They tend to be verbally aggressive, if not all the way up and through violence. Violence comes easy to them. It's really, there's very little inhibition. And so there's 20 of these traits that we assess. And so the scores will range from 0 to 40. The average North American inmate will score about 20 of those traits, kind of be halfway on it, most of the traits really. The average person in the community, the average so-called, normal person, is going to be about 4 or 5.
Wow.
And so the traits are distributed pretty normally. They have a big histogram. And so about 15 to 17% of the male prison population in all countries really will score in that clinical range, over 30. I asked my lab, when do you know you have somebody who meets all the clinical traits and fits the kind of criterion that I've written about, or Cleckley or Bob Hare, and it's about 34. So once you get above 34, you're dealing with somebody that really has the construct, really has the disorder, and that's what we're studying. And of course, we say disorder, and I think that's another thing that's important to discuss, and that's that these traits are not associated with good outcomes. They don't achieve normal educational or occupational success. They don't achieve typical relationship. I mean, most psychopaths by the age of 30 will have 4 or 5 marriages, which is spectacular. Yeah. I mean, they basically tell you they're just willing to engage and jump into a marriage without any consideration of staying. And they use up all the resources and have a lot of fun, and then they move on to the next thing. I mean, that was one of the traits that was just kind of strange, 5 marriages by the age of 30. And I thought that was just amazing. And then the first 2 or 3 guys that I interviewed all had been more than 5 marriages.
Wow.
And so it's a trait. It's just something that differentiates them from other, problems. and it's just a willingness to just engage in that. And most of them have no idea like who they're actually legally married to. Like they, they didn't ever go through a divorce process. Maybe the ex-wife did, and tried to get it, but they're very nomadic. They move around a lot. So it's just like there's like a biology or a drive to make them, get up and move from one place to the other. So they kind of just move around and consume resources. And then, and some of them are just, I wouldn't call them transient, but they'll only stay in a place for like 6, 8, 9 months, and then they'll move on to the next place. And it's just an interesting kind of component of of their biology is how frequently they move.
Right.
Yeah. So those are the traits. Yeah. And again, it's pretty rare. It's about 1 in 150 men will score in that range. But what I often tell people is, even if you have a boss, if you have somebody, that even scores, 17, 18, 19, even halfway there, and you're interacting with them, in the community, they're not going to be a great person to work for. You're going to think that they're just the worst thing on the planet, and you want to call them psychopathic, but then we'll be like, go meet one that really scores high, and you'll be like, wow, there's a real difference. So we in the field, right. We struggle to come up with how do we label that person, or and I'm like, well, they're just a 20, that's still really a high score, but it's not. It's in the 90th percent or probably 80th percentile of normal of like an average community population, where you might have 4 out of 100 that'll score in the high range. But it's still somebody that you're going to find that's really difficult. My friend Gina Vincent, who's a professor at UMass, she always says, I don't even want to date a 5. She's like, it's not going to end well. It's going to be
right.
fun and exciting for a little bit, but it's not going to end well. It's not conducive to family and stability and, child rearing. It's all of those things are just out the window with these guys. And so it's, that definitely is I think something to take home. Yeah.
Right. Super interesting. I didn't know that the average population was 4. I was going to ask that question. You preempted it. Super interesting. I could imagine that to be an interviewer, you have to be very skilled at knowing when you're being manipulated. Like you're trying to give someone an interview, and one of their key criteria is that they will lie and manipulate you. And you have to know when they're doing that and be able to cross-check that with verified information you've already seen. Yeah. And I could imagine that being very difficult because they've been lying and manipulating their entire lives, right? They're probably very good at it.
Yeah, they are. But often again, like, we're not in an adversarial situation. So if they are, they don't have their hackles up. They're not trying to fake anything or do anything to us. They might try to manipulate you to get you to bring in something for them. They might try to get you to bring in a cell phone and I wrote about this in my book that the first kind of weeks I was there, they tried to manipulate me to get me to bring in a package, that someone was going to give me, or, and so for drugs or for other things, there's that they will try to do those types of things, and you have to be very cognizant of the games that they'll play and how to avoid those things. But once you get past that stuff, when you're armed with all of that background information about them, you can really steer the conversation and probe them and get them, in a way that asks questions. You can sometimes even be pointed and just say like, but your file says this, like, what's your file say? You say that, but what does your file say? And then that allows you to kind of get them to like, wow, the file is going to tell you that this, and this, but that's kind of true. And then, you can see that they'll sometimes, if you will, even admit to or but they don't want to dwell on it. So they'll just move on very quickly. And sometimes they switch, immediately to something funny, or they'll tell you a story or a joke to just get away from the lull of something like that in the interview where you're trying to probe them about something like that. But see, the thing is that they don't have any empathy or remorse. They really, it's sometimes really a struggle because it just comes naturally to everybody else that you have these feelings of guilt or sadness or concern, and about other human beings. And so the way they'll talk about their victims and things, you're just kind of like, they don't have any concerns about telling you. So whereas you might think they might feel, they might be, recalcitrant or not wanting to talk about it. They don't have that. They almost boast about it. They'll be like, right. Oh yeah, that was a great one. Like that was really fun, or this, and this. And so the challenge is to be able to, and this is what we find, the challenge is to be able to have that conversation with them in such a way that you're not endorsing that they did something bad. You're letting them actually talk to you as if you almost can understand how they would like to do that or why they did that. You don't necessarily have to be a judge, judging them or doing anything like that. You don't usually confront them and say, things like that. You can allow them to really, and that's sometimes not easy for people to do. Some people get really shocked and scared, and they can't imagine, or they put themselves in the place of the victim, which is a real challenge, because you really can lose your ability to, I really have tried to avoid, interacting with the victims' families or others, because it makes it extremely difficult to stay clinically,
Right.
this is, based and stuff like that. And so you basically, I don't try to look at crime scene photos or other things that will make it extremely concrete. It's easier to just keep it as kind of an abstract thing in your head. This is what this guy did. And so in order to try to do the work that we're supposed to do, so in order to be able to develop a rapport, to then do all the other testing that we do, all the neuropsych testing, all the IQ testing, we study emotional intelligence, we do a whole bunch of other things with them. And so we don't want to, you don't want to do an interview for research purposes that makes them angry or mad or anything like that. So you really do want to, you just let them be themselves and let that come out in the interview. And that's in kind of contrast if you're doing this in a forensic environment where you might be assessing them for risk or treatment amenability, and in which case then, there's bigger stakes, and they may present differently to you in that situation than they would in the research context. And then you have to develop those skills to be able to get the information out of them. But the thing that's interesting about the PCL-R is even if they refuse to participate in the interview, provided you have sufficient file information, you can still score them and get a good estimate. And it might not be perfect, but the studies that have been done on this, you take 100 files and interviews, and you scramble them all up, and you give out 10 raters, and you have 10 of them, or 5 of them score ones without, half the file without the interview, and then the other half with the interview, and you scramble it all up, and you'll get a very similar score.
Interesting.
So the information and the personality still comes through in the files.
Right.
So.
Can you really tell the difference between a 40 out of 40 versus a 30 out of 40 during the interview? I wonder, how does that present in their mannerisms, in the way they present themselves? Like, maybe what are some common themes that you've seen that separate people that are really, really on that high end of the psychopathy distribution with somebody who's closer? 30 to 40 is
Sure.
still high end, but what separates them?
Yeah. So the it is true. It is true. It's the easiest thing to do when you're doing this scoring is somebody that scores really low. It doesn't have any of the traits at all. And you're kind of like, wow, why is he in here? It's something, versus the person that scores. And the same thing is true if someone scores really high.
Yeah.
Is that they just meet every single criterion. Sometimes they're just, wow. And, a 30 can sneak up on you depending upon the person's criminal history and lifestyle and other things. You can be like, okay, so, you get somebody that's all the way up to 30, and they might not have appeared that they had all of the manifestation of the traits. That might have been very straightforward in the interview and not told stories or done anything that was different from, so they might not have all of the traits in really high levels, but enough of them that they're going to score high. So that's what I was trying to illustrate earlier, is in the lab meeting, when somebody scores over 34, there's really not much difference between a 34 and a 38. It's really going to be there. There are some criterion, that are coded, that are kind of hard coded. So for example, if they didn't commit, or get arrested as a juvenile, let's say they lived in a rural location where they basically just picked the kid up and sent him home and didn't give him a formal charge, well, then they might not score high on the adolescent trait when they really did the behavior anyway, but they didn't get caught. There's some scoring nuances that occur. And so, or they might not have had a lot of opportunity to, maybe they've been in jail most of their life, and so they didn't have an opportunity to be married and have that item, many, marital relationships. So you would have to omit that item, which gives it a prorated number, and so then they're gonna really be very high on the test, but they might not have had an opportunity to achieve the high scores on on 4 or 5 of the items that the other ones did. And so there's that kind of variance. So really, these two parts of the test that we call them, if you throw all those traits into a statistical analysis called a factor analysis, it'll come up with that there's this interpersonal and affective grouping, and then there is the behavioral and impulsivity side of it. And so when we're talking with someone who scores high, they're normally going to score high on both of those two things. Whereas occasionally you'll get somebody that really just has the behavioral manifestation and they'll still get pretty high scoring, but they're really not the same as somebody that scores in that really high range. So what's interesting though is that each point, for every point that we score you, it adds about 4% predictive power of reoffending. So one of the reasons why psychopathy is extremely commonly used in criminal justice settings is that it predicts reoffending. So somebody that has all of these traits is basically 8 times more likely to commit a new violent crime than somebody who's low on the traits.
Wow.
And that's impressive. So I can share, we've published a whole series of papers now. We've been here, collecting data for almost 20 years in New Mexico. And we've been able to follow now and track for on average about 15 years, about 3,000 individuals. And psychopathy scores predict, felony reoffending and violent reoffending in boys that are incarcerated as kids, in young men that get released and get reincarcerated, in women, and girls. And so in every population that we've studied, it's one of the very best predictors of future violent outcomes. And so that's why it's often included in what we call a risk assessment. So when you're going out for parole or probation, and we're going to go do an assessment of, what are the variables that we want to mitigate. We want to put you in a drug treatment program because, drugs cause people to relapse to crime. We want to put you in an alcohol education program so that you don't go out and get drunk and get a DUI and come back to jail, et cetera. So we want to put you in facilities and give you things that we remediate those risk factors. And so for psychopathy, the typical thing might be, we'll keep them in a halfway house, give them a job. That's one thing. Keep them busy. So 8 to 5, they're in a job, and then they have to be back in a halfway house by 7 o'clock, and they have to be there, at night and stuff, to mitigate the chances they're going to do anything. I don't think it's formally been studied, but I believe giving them an ankle bracelet is probably one of the best ways to help prevent them, because they have then 100% certainty that they're going to get arrested again if they commit a crime. And so that kind of knowledge will help to mitigate the chances they'll commit a new crime. And so as a condition of parole, so when you still have your correctional hooks, so to speak, in them, then for 2 or 3 years, you can get them to try to break the cycle of crime by giving them a bracelet that they have to wear. So then you know where they are. And give them a job. That's probably the second thing. You could just want to keep them as busy as possible doing something pro-social. But It can be a job in, any kind of thing, landscaping to, cleaning up to doing, anything that's going to keep them interested. I think body work or working in a shop, like car shop or auto fab or something like that, where they're just really busy doing things and learning new skills. That's probably one of the things that mitigates the chances that they're going to relapse. But psychopathy across the world, is one of the best predictors of future violence.
What's a better predictor of future reoffending, the PCL-R or brain scans?
Well, they're complementary. So what you're tapping into is we've developed a whole number of methods for decoding the brain activity, the MRI data that we collect in them. So we have a mobile MRI that actually is in a trailer, a semi-trailer.
Yeah, talk about this. I loved reading about this. I had to I was like, is this a hallucination? I thought ChatGPT was lying to me. I was like, this can't be real. I looked it up and I was like, this is amazing. Go deep into this.
Right. Yeah. So the background on that is at one point in Canada, when we were working with these guys, we were also doing research on the MRI scanner at the university, which was about an hour and 10-minute drive, no traffic, from the prison to the university out on the peninsula at the University of British Columbia and in Vancouver. And we got permission. What happened was one day I was walking into the facility, and there was one of my inmates in his orange jumpsuit and shackles and 2 correctional officers transporting him. And he's like, "Hey, Kiehl," he's like, "Hey." And I was like, "What are you doing here?" He's like, "Well, I'm here for a treatment. I'm here for a medical appointment." And so I talked to the guys that were doing the treatment. Like, "Oh yeah, we escort guys out here all the time for their treatment." And I was like, wow, okay, so this is news. So we went back and we met with what's called the regional escort team, and we asked them, "Hey, would you guys be willing to bring them out for research purposes? Like bring out 5 guys on a Saturday and we would go scan them, and then you would take them back. And I mean, there's good Canadians. They said, sure, that sounds fun. We can do that. They didn't even end up charging us for that. They just the Correctional Services of Canada, had thought there was value in the research as well and the collaboration, and so we ended up being able to do that. We brought out about 50 men over 2 years and scanned them in the university scanner. They secured an entire wing of the hospital. They were always concerned about those that might be more organized criminally that get a breakout or something like that. But what they did is they just they shut down communications at the facilities. So there were no calls in or out for like 3 or 4 days, and they would always do it randomly. So no one would know when they were going to transport them, and then they would bring them out and we would scan them. And it was almost always on a weekend, but sometimes it was during the week, just to try to throw a curveball so that they would bring somebody out and then bring them back in and no one would know, for security reasons. And so it was fun to learn all of those things, just for one, but it was also that they brought them out, we would feed them, we would scan them, they would then take two and go back in one car that they had come out, and then they would put the guys in the van that they brought when they had done the other things. All the guys really enjoyed it. They participated, and they thought it was a get out of jail free card for a day. In fact, if anything, we had everybody sign up to try to do that, and that was a problem because we could only bring like 50. But what I realized was that there was really no way to do these studies in large numbers unless you figured out a way to take a machine or install a machine. Originally, the plan was to find a facility and park or put an MRI in there. So just to, go ahead and put one in there. And then I found out that they actually put them on wheels and you can move them. And then I got really, we completely redesigned or designed one of them for research purposes, made about 100 changes to the trailer itself, all sorts of upgrades to make it capable of doing what we needed to do. And then we got Siemens to agree for the MRI to put in an advanced MRI into one of the trailers, kind of the most advanced one they'd ever put in a trailer. And then I was able to find a way to get it funded, so that's one of the reasons I left Yale University, where I was when I got this idea, I moved to New Mexico. New Mexico was willing to buy one. So the nonprofit institute, it's called the Mind Research Network, they were willing to help purchase one because they believed in this vision. And the machine we've been using it for 20 years now. We actually have 2 of them now. And the first one, it's been to probably 50 prisons in 10 states. It's been all over the place. It's been to pueblos to study rural, issues in rural populations. We've taken it to an elementary school to scan kids there. We've taken it to retirement homes to scan, a community of aging populations. It's really designed to go anywhere there's a base or concentrated number of patients that you want to study that, or that would benefit from this, who couldn't otherwise get access to the machine. And so, yeah, it's been just fantastic. And I guess that's one of the things that we've developed a really great skill set. We have a really good team that knows how to manage it, drive it, move it, park it, all the requirements, managing it, keeping it running. It's just been a great experience. It's been obviously the highlight of my career. But we've studied now more than 5,000 inmates.
Wow, it's
and
incredible.
There's the closest, if you will, academic competitor has maybe done 30. So it's pretty much, we've cornered the market on this side of it. But we collaborate with people from all over the world. I have colleagues that we write grants together to go collect data, and then we send them the data. I have colleagues at Yale, Ariel Baskin-Summers, Jean Dessity at the University of Chicago. We do empathy work together. Dave Costin at Rosalind Franklin in Chicago as well. He's done a whole bunch of intensive stuff before that. Joe Newman at Wisconsin. Mike Koenig still at Wisconsin. There's just people kind of all over the place that we've been able to provide data for, and so that's
such a cool sign.
Yeah. So and we continue. I do podcasts and stuff like this because it's really fun to educate people and to tell these stories and to provide it. But you never know, some Secretary of Corrections might be watching this and say, "Hey, I'd like to have this work in my state." That's happened. I mean, there've been, you get invitations, you get people, or you get people calling and saying, "Hey, can you come do this or that, whatever." And I'm like, sure, if we can find the funding, right? If we can find someone to fund it, or probably should start a GoFundMe page or something. I've never done anything like that, but there's a lot of stuff that we'd like to do that we haven't been able to do, and so we're still, cooking, running along doing pretty well. And like I said, I have a really great set of team and staff. Some of my staff have been with me for 25 years. We've worked through all the ups and downs of funding cycles and everything else, and mergers with the nonprofit has merged with two other larger nonprofits to just part of the things that happen. And so we've been had a lot of really interesting things. But when you look back at it and everything that we've been able to accomplish, I mean, every year we have a nice Christmas party or holiday party, and I try to sit back and just take stock of everything that we did that year and just how amazing it is. And I've been just blessed with just great staff that have been, just fantastic to work with. So.
Right. You're the Tiger Woods of scanning psychopaths' brains. Such cool science. I've never asked people to like and share the episode, but do it now, anyone that's listening, so that we can get this video to a correctional officer so we can scan more brains, because it's important. Yeah. It really is important work. So let's go into some of those findings then. When you scan a psychopath's brain, right, what are the findings that you see again and again?
Right. So we talked about the mobile MRI. That's how we've been able to collect the data. And the MRI allows us to collect both, typical structural pictures of the brain, that everybody's familiar with seeing. We can also collect what's called diffusion tensor imaging, or imaging that allows us to measure white matter strength in the brain, if we will, the connective tissue, kind of the wiring of the brain. We also measure brain function using a technique that's called functional MRI. So this is a technology that essentially is measure changes in blood flow or hemodynamics. And when muscles, just like your muscle uses oxygen when you use it, every neuron, like if I move my fingers like this, the neurons in the motor system, and in the control areas of the brain that allow me to move my fingers will have more blood flow going to them than they did before I did that. So what I can do is I can then map, everywhere that, blood flow is going when I present a task to you. So let's say I have you doing an empathy task, or, look at people getting, hurt, for example. So simple things like a hammer or something, like hitting them on that thing, and then you have this kind of automatic empathy response, and we can study whether we get the same empathy response in people with psychopathic traits versus not, and things like that. And then, and of course, one of our main goals is to try to understand at a baseline how people are responding to these things, and then what can we do to develop a treatment? Can we manage it? But what we talked about earlier is prediction. So if I scan, of a couple hundred, individuals with psychopathy, how do their brains differ? Well, so the most reliable effects that we find is in the structural analysis that we do. So we'll do a quantitative structural MRI analysis, which basically looks at every single pixel or voxel, three-dimensional unit in the brain, and it'll analyze the volume or the data that's in there, and then it'll tell us whether or not it's weaker or stronger, basically. Do you have more or less muscle mass and all the gray matter, the thinking areas of the brain? And individuals with high psychopathic traits, they have less gray matter in the orbital frontal cortex, in the anterior temporal, right here bilaterally, and in the medial temporal, what we call the amygdala. And then there's a smattering of other areas that some studies find, like insula, which is an area that's part of that empathy network, or the cingulate, which is this thing that wraps all the way around the brain. And the cingulate is involved in attention and cognitive control. And some studies will find cingulate response differences in psychopathy or not, but not all studies. And so it's part of a network. And those regions, the temporal pole, the amygdala, the orbital frontal cortex, I mean, almost everybody in the field would agree that those areas are commonly found to be different. And certainly when you work with a clinical population in a prison, and so people have really high levels of the traits, and you do the expert rater assessment versus other types of self-report tests, then you're going to get very replicable findings.
Can you explain what that is, the expert rater test?
Yeah, so the Harris Psychopathy checklist, the PCL, that's the expert rater. So me and expert had gone in and scored it.
Right.
Alternatives are things like a self-report test, where I just give you a test and says, fill out the bubbles, tell me, do you feel like this? Do you think like this? And those can be really manipulated, or you can just refuse. And so even though I've developed these tests and have used them before, I don't recommend those tests for the clinical populations. But nevertheless, there's some value in doing them in community samples and other samples, but we generally find that they're not that helpful in a clinical sense. So so when you use the expert rater and you do the brain scans for clinical populations, that we do find really reliable things. And so the way we interpret it is that there's like 5% less working memory. It's like they have 5% less muscle mass in those areas of the brain from as early as age 12, 13, 14 that we've scanned. And
Interesting.
so that's one of the structural MRI effects. And then, of course, what we also find is that the function in those areas is often diminished. And so if you present stimuli to them that are supposed to engage the amygdala or engage the temporal pole, we see less hemodynamic activity in the same areas. And then what you can do is you can take that data and you can say, all right, well, let's say psychopathy predicts reoffending. Does the brain data predict reoffending as well? And
Right.
it does. And
Wow.
so, and I think, what we find there is, as we've already talked about, it's really easy to score somebody 40 out of 40. When they fit all the criterion, you're often left there after scoring them, then you're like, man, their real score is going to be like 50 out of 40, but the test doesn't go that high. But the MRI scanner, it doesn't care. Like, it's just the data.
Right.
And so the MRI scanner has additional information in it that you can capture if you do it, if you analyze it correctly. You can find that information and then use that on top of the psychopathy score, and it'll find additional predictive value. So they complement each other. Basically, if you put just the clinical data alone in a risk equation or just the imaging data, we normally will find that the imaging data predicts a little bit better than the clinical data by itself alone. And so,
Interesting. That's kind of
yeah,
unsettling,
and that's
isn't it?
because, well, that's where it comes from. I mean, your
Yes.
personality, your IQ, your age, all of those things are in your brain. And so if we can find a way to decode that, then it should predict just as well or better than a clinical assessment. And I'll give you another example in a second. So that's one of the things that we find is that this neuropredictive framework, it adds a little bit more utility, but it also tells us what areas of the brain are relevant so that you can develop a treatment, whether that's a drug that works on that area or a TMS, like transcranial direct current stimulation, that we might reset or reboot it with the treatment. That the TMS is used for depression and a variety of other conditions, substance use treatment. And so we might be able to use it to treat those areas of the brain specifically. Like, you're not going to treat the visual system, right? So, but the issue is because there's nothing wrong with that in psychopaths, but it is wrong in other conditions. And so, but if we want to treat the temporal lobe, then we would be putting the sensors over the temporal lobe to try to, change those circuits. Just like if we have training modules, if we have mindfulness stuff, getting yourself to remediate or ruminate on things to try to help you be more thoughtful and mindful. Well, that's going to engage this empathy network, and that's going to hopefully make it be more responsive. And so then we would suggest mindfulness might be a good technique to work with psychopaths because we know what systems of the brain it works on. So that's how you kind of try to frame this in terms of the treatment application and the translational ability. But we did this first study years ago where when you're doing one of these tasks on the scanner and you make a mistake, your brain fires that recognizes that you've made a mistake. And you have both a cognitive process that I know I made a mistake, but you also have kind of an affective response that you're, damn it, I didn't mean to make that mistake and I don't want to do it again. And so what we've been able to show is that the activity in the anterior cingulate, if you had really low activity there, that is, you just didn't care, one interpretation of the data, you didn't care that you made a mistake, you had low activity, that predicted reoffending as well as anything else that we measured, even psychopathy. So your brain response to that kind of cognitive control, this attentional control, was predictive of reoffending as well as any other variable that we collected. And so that was the first demonstration, because we followed the guys for like 3 years after they got their scan, and we showed that the scan predicted. And now what we've done, and so you can kind of take any variable. And so in that case, we were basically decoding impulsivity. So we were measuring cognitive control related to impulsivity. We included behavioral tests of impulsivity. We included expert rater measures of impulsivity. We included the data, your behavioral data, but the brain data was more sensitive than any of those other modalities to the outcome variable, the reoffending. And then I was like, all right, well, how do I demonstrate this to people, skeptics, maybe you might even call them? So age is one of the best predictors. So when you're a young man, you're more likely to reoffend than when you're an older man, even
Makes sense.
couple of years. But if you go back and you think about it, well, when I was 20 years old, I had a lot of friends that were very mature and studying and going to med school, and they did not get in trouble. And then I had another group of friends that was more fun to hang out with, that was really silly and would go out. And even though we were all 20 years old at the time, there was a gradient of maturity amongst those 20-year-olds that was different. Well, if I just enter your age of 20 into a risk equation, I'm not accounting for that variability in their maturational levels, right? So some are more mature than others. So we have this thing that we can calculate today called brain age. And what we do is we decode the brain imaging data, and we can identify what areas of the brain are what areas of the brain predict your chronological age, and then we can identify departures from that. So in the aging literature, if you have a brain age that is 75, but you're actually only 65, you're older, that your brain looks older than a reference database of others, then you're going to have about that you actually test your cognitive decline scores are going to be about 75 as well. So your brain age actually predicts that you're going to have bad cognitive test scores and or good test scores. If you're 65 and you look 55, you're going to have a cognitive test score that follows and tracks with that. So the idea here is just like we have growth curves for our kids, that your kids have these things that they're supposed to follow, and they're in the 10th or 15th percentile, like during pregnancy, they make a big deal out of these things. And what we're doing the same thing with the brain age stuff. So what we were able to do is we took like 1,000 offenders and we threw their brain data into a big algorithm that kind of pulled out networks of the brain. And then we figured out which networks of the brain predicted age. And then we asked, well, of those networks that predict age, do any of them predict reoffending? And so it turned out that, just like you would expect, there were several components related to the age of these areas, the temporal lobe and the orbital frontal cortex, that were more predictive of reoffending than chronological age. So your brain data was more diagnostic for reoffending than was actually using, because it accounted for that variation in maturation. And so,
that makes sense.
That was, yeah. And so that was one of a cool demonstration. Well, we've just done the same thing, with IQ. So IQ often is low IQ individuals are more likely to reoffend than high IQ individuals. And it might just be that they're more likely to get caught, but either way, they reoffend. And so IQ is, of course, comes from the brain, and you can quantify it very readily with a variety of techniques. And so we did, and we decoded IQ in the brain. And it turns out the same thing that we've just said is your brain's IQ, like your brain age, is actually more predictive of reoffending than is your regular IQ. And so this is, again, an example of how we can decode the constructs that we've measured in psychology using imaging data, and it actually ends up giving us unique information. First of all, it predicts as well or better, but it also tends to identify the circuits that are likely to be predictive, which gives you treatment targets.
Really cool. It's probably worth stating that I think you're able to make the claims that you've been able to make from statistical power because you drove around in your RV collecting that much data, right? Like it's worth stating that takes a lot of scans to be able to build up the evidence required to kind of make those claims that you're making.
No, absolutely. And always in these cases, you always want to be in science kind of first to first out there to do something. And so when we publish a first paper like that, even in the brain age paper, I mean, we had 1,000 subjects that we developed the model with. We had another 500 that we replicated the model in, and then we tested it in a new out of sample, another 100 men that we had the outcome data in. And at this point, and it generalized across those 3 different samples. So that's the state of the art today. If you can do that in 3 different samples and show that all of them are just as predictive, then that's what we hold people to today, right? And so we're now working on a revision of that with 5,000 people, and I have no doubt that it will work.
Right.
So what does that mean? I mean, the goal of doing it in a much larger sample would be whether, is that ready to be used in a clinical sense? Would you want to use this test in some way? Would I license it to some company that would want to provide, scans to people to help study, their outcomes and other things? And I don't know that the criminal justice system is necessarily going to be a big consumer of MRI data for this purpose, but the work will translate to other, domains. It will translate to maybe school outcomes or school performance or sports related things. You can use the same math to study athletic performance and how people perform under pressure. I mean, you can do a variety of other, tests, but the math is the same. To look at different outcomes. And so our goal was to just kind of prove it in a forensic sample, the value of it. And again, really the main motivation behind working and studying and trying to understand these guys is so that we can develop a way of treating them, so that we could treat them in such a way that we could remediate or stop these things from happening. And when we have time, I'll talk about the best treatment program that we know that's out there
Right.
that actually has made some pretty good inroads in doing this.
It is a little unsettling to me that brain scan data, a snapshot of the brain in one moment, is more predictive of future reoffending than all of the interviews and all of the background information in some sort of composite score. You know, the brain is incredibly complex, 86 billion neurons, more synapses than there are atoms in the Milky Way. You know, a lot of different fields have trouble really decoding what's in the brain because the signals can be so noisy. It's very hard to really extract signal from what is the most complicated system in the known universe. Yet you're able to really well map that data onto reoffending. I'm curious, was that a surprising finding for you, or was that expected?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and certainly I would agree with you that the brain scan data and learning how to decode it and learning how to put it in a predictive framework is a challenge. And what we've leveraged, if you will, or even to use your things, who's the shoulders that we've stood on of people who have done clinical assessments and developed risk equations for 20 or 30 years. And so
Right.
to identify the variables that we know, the psychological constructs that predict, just pick psychopathy, to be able to have that, and then to be able to understand really carefully which circuits relate to that condition. And then all we've done is said that we've just measured it in a slightly different way with a different, modality. And that is end up being incrementally predictive, is really just capitalizing on all of that other research. The other thing that I like to highlight is we're fortunate because we have 100% capture of our outcome variable. What that means is that we're able to identify and track perfectly 100% of those people we've studied. So we know that we're going to be able to get whether they've reoffended or not. We can identify them perfectly. And so in some studies and some medical outcomes, people are lost to a variety of different, issues or methods, or they don't, they're censored cases in these risk equations. And so they don't become as predictive or as useful. But in our case, we can actually have that, and we have a really great way of doing that. And we can track people whether they leave the state or they go to anywhere else, right? We can still be able to find them in public records to get the data that we need. And that's a real strength and a value. So I think that there's several important points. The first is we're very good today at developing methods to decode the brain data and to make it reliable in such a way that we can then determine if we can use it in a predictive framework. And the structural MRI data is extremely reliable. If I scan you, once a week for a month, and as long as you don't move your head in the scanner, I'm going to get exactly the same results from your brain, day upon day upon day. If I move to, and same thing for diffusion-based data, we haven't really talked about that, but mapping the white matter, there are certain areas of the brain that connect the frontal and temporal lobe. It's called the uncinate fasciculus, and this little fiber bridge is abnormal in psychopathy. And it's one of those things that we're working on now to see if that's also predictive. But the numbers that we get from there are very stable. They don't change in a day, a week, a month. When the functional MRI data, the first paper that we published using the functional MRI technique, that's likely to be more difficult to replicate or to generalize because, depending upon how someone performs the task on a day or week or month, if they get better or worse at the task, their brain's going to track with that. If they move their head a little bit, or if they do something else in the scanner, then there's going to be more variability. So there's more variability in the functional MRI technique than there is in the other techniques. And it's one of the reasons why I've moved to, in this predictive framework that we've developed, to structural based analyses, because they're so replicable. They're stochastic, which means that if I analyze the data, I get the same answer every time. There's no variability, and I can get you the same answer every time over, and that's what people want. Yes, it does surprise people that if I scan your brain, if you come out and you want to get a scan, we'll scan your brain. There's a lot of information in that structural MRI data. Your
sure.
IQ's in there, your personality's in there, your substance use history, your alcohol. Let's assume you had a drink or two before. There's all of that information can be found or decoded, and in such a way that it might be helpful to understand or predict in certain frameworks. So it's by no means perfect, though. I mean, we're not trying to replace the clinical tests and the clinical assessments that are being used. But again, the real goal of this science is that it provides a way of identifying precise locations of the brain that are in need of remediation or treatment. And that's the exciting part of the science, is that we're able to do that. So, we get asked all the time too, when will this stuff be used in court, or when will you want to testify to this, or when would you want to be using it to make decisions if it really is better? And again, I'm cautious there. I think that it would need to meet there are very stringent, I do teach in the law school here at UNM, and I've taught many other law schools over the years. You have to meet the evidentiary rules for Fryer Dahlberth, the two legal standards for admissibility in U.S. courts, or the federal rules are a little different still. And it's just not there yet. The science needs to be replicated by others or generalized to others. And we're working on that, but it would be great to have somebody else that was doing similar stuff that we could leverage and see. And there are some data sets that are out there that could be, used for this point. Pittsburgh longitudinal study had MRI data, and they tracked guys for a long period of time. And they have also shown that amygdala volumes predict future or reoffending as adults. And so there's, all of those things are possible. And we're also working with some other really fascinating data looking at trying to predict, the worst outcomes, predicting who commits a homicide, predicting how the brains differ in individuals who have committed that, kind of pet ultimate crime, the worst thing, that's out there, and how we might go about even remediating the highest risk, subjects. But again, I think that the MRI data and analysis are only getting better. It's only getting, more accurate. And so as long as you adhere to these kind of basic principles of decent sample sizes, right? So powered well studies, out of sample replication, and then really good outcomes data so that you have something that you can predict that's good. Because if I have a terrible outcome data point, I'll never predict it. Nothing will predict it. The clinical data won't predict it. So when you get good outcomes data from decent samples, then you've got a working chance to make the imaging data. But back to your point, back to your question. I mean, when I first approached a postdoc of mine, Al Aharoni, now he's a tenure professor at Georgia, I went to him and I said, listen, this is we want to test this neuropredictive framework. We want to start with this sample. Let's start with our favorite task. We call it's the go-no-go task that I was talking about before. And I said, let's just look at, two areas of the brain, anterior cingulate and insula, and let's see whether or not those areas predict reoffending. And he's like, it's not going to work. He hates it when I tell a story because he's like, it's not going to work. And now it's his most famous paper because, I told him, I said, let's go do it. Right. Like, this is what we're in this research network that was funded by the MacArthur Foundation on law and neuroscience. And I was like, they want to know if, there's anything we can do to kind of stimulate a field growth, to grow this field of law and neuroscience. And so he went and he came back. It was only like a week. And he just comes back and he goes, here. And he goes, you're not going to believe this. And he said, I couldn't believe it. It's really predictive. Wow. And I'm like, well, it should be, it's supposed to be. So I'm really happy that, it was predictive. And I said, let's write that up. And so we did. It got published in National Academy of Sciences, and it's a great journal. And it really kind of, it did what it was supposed to. It stimulated a lot of debate. It stimulated a lot of conversation. It got a lot of other people to reanalyze data sets that they had. It got us to focus on a variety of other things. And it did exactly what it was, meant to do, which was to get people talking about whether this is good or bad or otherwise. And so, and it led to a whole series of studies that have shown that it generalizes to women, that it works currently working on a study trying to look at it in youth and kids, and trying to figure out, how the developmental processes play into this outcome variable, or this predictive framework. So yeah, it's been really great and fun. And, we're continuing to just take all of the risk variables and find a neural correlate of them, and then try to determine if that neural correlate predicts as well as the clinical variable.
Right.
And that's been, one of our fun, challenges. And, we just assign each basically grad student to go tackle one of those variables, and they end up, a month later, they come back and, and they're like, it's the same, or it's a little different, or it does predict. And in most of the cases, we find that the neural data is adding a little bit more predictive variance. And that's because, again, measurement in psychology of IQ of anything is often considered pretty good, but it's not perfect. And so the MRI data, if it's good data and high quality data, then it will add to that, utility if it's
Right.
and so that's the framework that we're working with.
For the listeners that maybe aren't intimately familiar with that methodology, the no-go stop cognitive control test, what exactly is that? Like, if we take a psychopath behaviorally in the world, like, what is that test extrapolating that makes it so predictive in your view?
Yeah, so the task is essentially you're pressing a button for some stimuli and trying not to press for others. And so it's an X and a K. So they look very similar. But as you're doing this, you're going fast and the stimuli come pretty quickly and randomly. So they're jittered, if you will. It's a tough task and you will make mistakes. It's designed so that everyone will make some mistakes. Individuals with psychopathic traits tend to make a few more mistakes. That is, their systems don't tend to adapt and learn from this as quickly, and so they tend to make more mistakes. And that's the analog to how they behave in the community, is that they tend to get out there and not pay attention to these signals that tell them to stop doing what they're doing or to be less impulsive. And so that's the analog. There's of course thousands of papers on go-no-go tasks in all forms of what we call disinhibitory psychopathology. So people that have impulse control disorders are often showing abnormalities. We publish papers on people that have obsessive compulsive thoughts and even up to hoarding kind of thoughts, where you worry a lot about things. And so that circuit basically just fires. It's like twice as big of a system. It's like overreactive. But the individuals with psychopathy, they're underreactive. They just don't worry about something. I mean, this is another thing that's going in my next book. But if you want to get a psychopath to look at you funny, ask him if he's ever worried about leaving the oven on. And he'll go, what?
Wow.
What? Why would I? They look at you like you've asked them, like from another planet or something, because that's never been a thought that's come into their head. They just don't ruminate and worry about things like that. And so it's a very telling kind of process.
That stress response has got to be different then, is it right? They must have just not the same sort of cortisol response from like, oh my God, I left the oven on, like I'm going to damage something I own, like that cognitive process, that stress response that most people have, they must just not have.
So the worry is not there. The rumination, the worry is gone. Yeah, there's no sense of worry. Yeah, they don't worry about anything.
And even if
don't
it's
worry about getting caught
to them, like in the case where they left the oven on there, it's only them that's going to maybe pay the consequences of that if they burn their own house down. They don't even care then.
Yeah, I would probably share with you that most psychopaths will never have the credit score to get a house. So they're not going to really own one if they score in that really high range.
Gotcha.
And so there's going to be a rental thing. But I don't even think that even comes into play. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like they just don't worry about those types of things. And so whereas, the average person might worry about it. I often worry about our gas barbecue that we have is connected directly to the main. And so if I left it on the barbecue, it could go for weeks and I wouldn't know, and it'd be a bill coming, And so I do often go check that at night after grilling, to make sure that it's all off. And, if anything, I should put a stop valve in there so that I can get in there and make sure that it's off. But it's, those types of things. That's just one example of I'm trying to share with you about how they are really different and really don't seem to have that. And it's really hard for people to grasp this because they're like, that's like just so different. It's so foreign. I don't know how I could think like that. And so, it's the same thing with the empathy is, I'll put up an equation, one of Einstein's field equations for the theory of general relativity. And I'll tell people here, you want to know how a psychopath feels when you ask them, do they feel bad for what they did? And I put up this equation. I go, solve this. And people just stare at it blankly, right? You look at it blankly and you're like, I have no idea even where to start. Right. Well, that's how
such a good example. It's such a good,
don't
it's
feel
complete befuddlement.
Yeah. And I said, that's how they feel when you ask them about empathy. They don't have that skill.
Yeah.
They don't have that intrinsic, understanding or appreciation. And it's really people just, how is that possible? And you're like, whoa, that's this condition, and what's, I guess why I'm emphasizing this is that that's what's really different. I mean, there really aren't any other conditions that have that trait. So no other forms of psychopathology have as their central focus a lack of empathy, guilt, and remorse. Other conditions have impulsivity problems, and that's shared with psychopathy. There's common systems that appear to be dysregulated in that sense, and so whereas in the profound difference is there's this lack of concern or empathy that's really different.
Right.
So yeah. Anyway, but back to the brain data, I think that people are becoming more accepting of this, especially. Well, that's one of the reasons why the Brain Age paper was so well, it got one of the fastest reviews ever. It was published in like a week from when we submitted it. And that's because there's people using and testing Brain Age in many other contexts. And so they're testing Brain Age to predict developmental course or academic scholastic aptitude. And they're using it to study a lot of aging related processes. And so the construct, the philosophy, the math is well developed. And
Right.
so people now, what we did is we just adapted it to a different population and a different outcome variable. And so everybody was like, yes, this totally makes sense. In fact, we weren't the first people to do Brain Age. I mean, other people came up with that idea, and now there's probably conferences dedicated to just the developments in Brain Age right now, and in its potential predictive utility. And people will decode age with many different modalities of the MRI. They'll try the structural, the diffusion. They'll study, the functional stuff. I mean, resting state, connectivity measures. We've published many papers that show that age is a great predictor of the networks, how they evolve and change over time, and how they get disrupted, by certain forces, especially like traumatic brain injury, et cetera. But there's just a tremendous amount of growth in studying those things and their replicability and generalization. So these are all, areas that continue to develop and grow. But
Yes.
yeah, I think that it's I think most people can kind of understand that, as long as you're not a dualist, so they understand that, your personality, your IQ, those things, they are instantiated in the brain. And if we can decode, if MRI is a good probe of it, well, then we'll be able to help find value in
Yes.
that data.
A thing that you mentioned a while ago that I wanted to go back to is you said that these brain changes, there's evidence that those brain changes go back to when they were maybe 10, 11, 12. I'm curious how we know that, and just to talk around that a little bit, because that kind of blows my mind. The order of causality is unclear when you measure a brain at 40 and you see a
Sure.
small amygdala, right? It's always the question of, does psychopathy create a small amygdala, or does a small amygdala create psychopathy or any other thing? So I'm curious to go back in time to adolescence.
Absolutely. So what I'll start with is the first paper we published, and now there have been many others like this, have shown that the amygdala is probably one of the most predictive structures in its relation to psychopathy. So the amygdala is what is the amygdala? The amygdala is a small almond-shaped structure in the brain that's got like 9 different nuclei in it. It's very responsive to fear and salient stimuli in the environment that you need to respond to or attend to. If it fires, it can often fire even before attention can be to that there was something there. Like, it's a reflexive, important, adaptive thing. And the amygdala is very sexually dimorphic, so it's much bigger in men than women, probably due to the evolutionary history of, and the need to be hunter-gatherer, hunting, and doing that out is you have to be more fast at processing, salient environmental stimuli, more than others, or fighting or other types of things. But the amygdala is one of the more replicable structures that is smaller in psychopathy. And so they're basically less responsive to fearful stimuli. They don't show the same kind of fear potentiated startle responses, especially affective startle. So they're not going to, and that structure is abnormal in the men that are 30 years old when we study them. So you asked the question perfectly. So if I live am I born that way, or is a 30-year history of chronic antisocial drug abuse and everything else led it to be smaller? So what we did is we took them in their average age, I think, is 15. And these are kids in a Supermax facility who are there. All of them for 85, 90% have felony convictions as youth, most of them for violent crimes. And in that sample of 202 boys, we found the same structural deficits. So by age 15, there was no difference. There's no aging effect between the 15 and 30-year-olds. It doesn't seem to get smaller. It's exactly the same. When you overlap the
Right.
histograms, they're the same. So that would suggest that at least by the age of 15, it's already crystallized. So the developmental processes or whatever has led it to be there. Now, I'm sure there are data, and I'm not that aware of it, but like the Abide data set, this is a longitudinal cohort sequentials from 2 to 30. We should track and see whether the amygdala is something that is changing in size over time, and whether or not there might be some critical window or impairment that could have caused it to stop or to be to not develop normally. But my guess, because we see this 30-year-olds and even 50 at this point, they have smaller amygdala, and down to 15, is that we would probably still be seeing that when you're younger. So as long as you measure the traits of psychopathy carefully, and then you will probably find that it's going to be smaller even as you get into the younger and younger ages. And that's because the behaviors were there, right? So they acted, they had these traits and behaviors from a very early age as well. How early can we go? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, whether we could go back to 5, 6, 7. There are people, there's Eva Kimones, Paul Frick, there's a lot of people that work and trying to study and measure these traits really in young kids to try to help understand and develop protocols for treatment, how to teach parents how to manage them. So for example, they don't learn from punishment. This is a central feature of psychopathy, is that punishment will not change their behavior in a way that, parents would hope. The threat of punishment doesn't. The threat of authoritative, responses does not change their behavior, but positive reinforcement does. So giving them rewards and giving them what we call contingency management schedules. So the more positive the more pro-social they are, let's say, then the more rewards you give them to watching video games on the weekends or playing video games and watching movies on the weekends and stuff like that, that they will rapidly behave if they can achieve and get those positive things. And so when you work within that kind of a framework, those types of positive reinforcements work with a number of different groups that are on this kind of, if you will, antisocial spectrum. And they tend to be, they tend to do things better. It really works well with substance use. So if you take offenders who are, or individuals who commit or get caught for, possessing drugs or using drugs, and you bring them in, the judge can sentence them to certain forms of treatment. The first one, I believe, was called Project Hope. It was in Hawaii, basically implemented this program. And what happens is every week, they have to come in and test on their day off for, urine tests to test to see if they've been using drugs. And if they test clean, then they get like $100 and gift cards that they can go take their family to the movies, or they can go get gas at the station, things like that. And what happens is it escalates. So at the end of 2 weeks, it's like 120 and then 160 and then so on and so forth over 3 months. Every week they're getting kind of improved, positive reinforcement money, contingency management. And what that does is it breaks the cycle of addiction. They learn that they're just fine without doing all of these things, and it really prevents relapse. And if they do relapse, well, the punishment is ubiquitous, and there's no so if you don't show up, or if you do test hot, you lose your next weekend. So if you work weekends, and Monday and Tuesday is your weekend, then you don't lose your job, because you show up and you come in on Sunday night and you have to spend your Monday and your Tuesday, your weekend, in jail, and you don't get any positive things from that. But if you otherwise keep a clean history, and they do that because you don't lose their job, right? They don't lose their apartment. They basically have a small punishment. And it's the punishment is just there. There's no way to change it. You can't wiggle out of it. If you don't show up for your urine test, doesn't matter why, you lose the weekend, doesn't matter. And so they learn that then they show up, but what that does is that contingency management is the type of schedule, the type of reinforcement that works and people really well, better than the type of threats of punishment or other types of things. Or uncertainties in punishment, especially.
Is this for all ages? Would this protocol be for across the spectrum of ages?
They did. Yeah, they did it. They did it for all ages. In fact, I think there's 22 states now. The National Institute of Justice years ago implemented this kind of in 22 different states and studied it. And New Mexico has some sites as well. And it really does work. I mean, it really is cheaper. It's cost effective. It really does help break the cycle of relapse. And it's been used wide. I don't remember what it was called after Project Hope, but that's where you could start. And this is a good time to talk about it because the people ask about, can you treat psychopaths? Can you make them
Yes.
better? And Wisconsin is the best state that has implemented a kind of just a fantastic program. It's at a place called decompression therapy, but it's implemented at a place called the Mendota Juvenile Treatment Center in Madison, Wisconsin. What happened originally, the foundation of the program was that the state was seeing a lot of boys were getting released from state custody, adolescents, and they were committing bad crimes, especially homicides. And it got so bad that literally the state legislators walked down the street to the university campus and went into the clinical psych program and said, how would you guys deal with this? And they said, well, we would treat them. And they said, well, how would you treat them? Well, we would design a treatment to remediate them. So they went over to this program and created a program at the mental health hospital, which was only, just a jump over the lake from the university. And 3 guys basically developed this intensive year-long cognitive-based, treatment program that starts with really stabilizing them if they have any severe mental health related or acutely, need to be managed. And then once they're stable, they start engaging them individually. They get positive reinforcement, anything from like candy bars all the way up to video games in their cells. If they do something bad, they lose their privileges, but they can get them back very quickly. And so they learn that if they engage with everybody, that's part of the decompression, because the boys in these systems, they have become arrested and incarcerated, and they really don't have any behavioral repertoire. The only thing that they'll get all the way down to solitary confinement, and the only thing that gets them any interaction with anybody else is to fight. And so they learn how to uncompress those attitudes and things and start to trust and work with the staff. And then they can meaningfully start to engage in treatment and therapy, and they work through cognitive-based processes. And it continues to have these positive schedules of reinforcement all the way through. They bring the families in, so that they do what's called multi-systemic family therapy. That's another big component, where you bring the family in and the family stays and works with the kid and sets up all sorts of plans for how and what the expectations are of the parents and what the kid's going to need to do and how they're going to do it when they get released. So you're not just taking them and throwing them right back into this environment that's likely to cause conflict and problems. Everyone gets a set of expectations and plans for how they're going to, behave, how it's going to work when they get released. And what they found, and then they followed these boys for years. And in the first study, they had about 200 boys that completed the treatment program, and they had to do 12 months. If they did really less than that, they didn't see any meaningful changes. So it takes time. And so the 12 months, kind of treatment shows a 50% reduction in violent crime.
Wow.
Compared to the boys that are in a treatment as normal, just in the system as normal, but of similar types of boys, if you will. And so the Department of Corrections was only sending the kids that they couldn't manage at other facilities to this facility. So they're the highest risk, kids in the state, the kids that are the most problematic to treat. The reason why the program has lasted 20 years is because they passed a state law creating it and creating a budget for it. And I'm sure there are budget fights every year, as there are in every legislator, but it's continued and been able to, it's ebbed and flowed in terms of size, but they've been able to maintain and continue it. And they show that it does have these positive, meaningful effects. That is, it reduces violent outcomes. And most of the boys, they score pretty high on the youth version of psychopathic traits. And so it's pretty exciting to see that it can. In my field, when you can reduce violent outcomes, in this case 50%,
it's huge.
That's pretty spectacular. Yeah, the boys are by no means cured or anything, but they are definitely not engaging in the same types of behaviors. And one of the most striking statistics is that 16, the 200 boys who got released in the system as normal group, they killed 16 people in 2 years. Whereas the boys from MJTC, even though 1 in 7 came back for a violent crime, they didn't result in any deaths. And so that again is an enormous progress and treatment success to be able to see that. So we're just very it's just a fantastic
That's so cool.
example, but it does take enormous political commitment, by somebody to come in and want to create this. And I've had multiple other states ask if that could be replicated, and New Mexico is one, and stuff like that. But it's essentially, I think, the only way. One of the main reasons for its longevity and its success is that it's a state law, And so that would be the process. That you'd have to get some, folks that want to implement it or create it to start there. And once the
Right.
legislature buys in, then it will matriculate down through the system and could get implemented
It's an
in other
amazing
states.
practical effect of scientific research. Like, and God, the world just seems so bloody violent at the moment. Social media is definitely amplifying it, but God, and kind of especially America, I don't know how you feel about it, but America especially just seems like there's literally public assassinations like every week, you know? So I don't think anyone can doubt the incredible benefit of your work and what you're doing when it can result in protocols that have such a dramatic effect on stuff like violence and murders. And it's clearly an
Well,
incredible
yeah.
outcome.
The, I really have to. I mean, I wish I had designed the MJTC program, but I have to give the guys credit there. Like we've been working with them for years. I wanted to study, and we had a grant that was to study and scan and examine how the brain changes over time with that treatment, and then
Yes.
does that predict desistance? And we were right in the middle of that grant when COVID hit, and we had to pause it and stuff like that. So we're hoping to restart and do more of that work with them to try to see how the brain does change with these types of programs and treatments. And so it really is an exciting thing, but I have to just give them 100% credit for developing, implementing, and maintaining it. And certainly the state of Wisconsin has shown massive benefits. In fact, economically, it's amazing. So if the memory serves, for every $10,000 the state invested in that treatment, it returns $70,000 in reduced incarceration costs.
Right.
Yeah, in like a 4-year period. So even though it costs more money to implement it than, not doing any treatment, the return on investment is just amazing. And so if you can capture that, if you can capture those resources in a budget process, then you really are doing way better. And also think about that. I mean, to the 15 murders that were committed, the amount of money and cost is associated with that loss of life and the investigations and the police and then the incapacitation for life usually, plus the loss of life. I mean, that's just untold emotional costs. Eliminating those homicides by implementing the treatment isn't even part of the calculus there. So that's a tremendous amount of savings across every measurable domain, economic, emotional, affective, societal, that these types of programs and implementations, if they're done well, are just amazing. But
Yeah.
I'll be honest, like it's not easy. Like this program is expensive. It takes a lot of time and energy and a lot of commitment, and it's something that you just can't hand wave at these kids and think that you're going to change them.
Yes.
We've followed up 500 boys in the juvie supermax in New Mexico, and 88% of them are back in prison. So that's just like they're really what that suggests is that there really wasn't anything meaningfully done with them while they were in juvie to try to curb them from maintaining this high risk trajectory.
Right.
And I don't really fault New Mexico. New Mexico is no different than every other state except Wisconsin. They're the only ones that have shown and published meaningful peer-reviewed published evidence that they can actually remediate the highest risk kids.
Very cool.
And I would hope every state would replicate that. But,
Right.
yeah.
You half answered my next question here. I was really curious, is there any evidence that any protocol can have actual brain wiring changes? Like over a certain amount of time, can we grow the amygdala? Can we restore gray matter to the orbitofrontal cortex? Can we improve emotional regulate? Like these sort of actual,
Yes.
we might have a great outcome in not offending, but can we actually make permanent brain changes that persist over a lifetime?
So, I mean, my answer to that would be yes. The brain is extremely plastic and it is very much capable of changing. There are certain medicines like SSRIs that are known in animal models to increase, neurogenesis in places like the amygdala. You can grow new neurons, and if you can be growing those neurons while you're doing an empathy-based treatment or a treatment that's trying to help have those neurons have value, if you will, in terms of how they might respond, then I think absolutely yes. And we do know that certain forms, just learning to juggle, for example, will rewire the brain. There was a couple of papers published years ago that showed that just juggling will change the way that the brain is connected. And so that's just a behavioral treatment, for a motor process and coordinated process. But the same thing we believe is true. And there have been little analyses now and a handful of studies on how mindfulness changes the brain, and then how mindfulness, if you keep and maintain it, and continue to use the skills, will have a very meaningful effect on outcomes, reducing substance use, relapse, reducing other behavioral problems, improving relationships, with others, and having you basically just stop and think about, the best possible outcome for yourself and the best possible outcome for the other people that you're there with. I do believe that there are opportunities to do this. In the prison system, there's a long history of people doing experiments and things that would never be repeated today, and so it can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge to implement kind of novel treatments or other things with these populations. But we are optimistic that we might be able to do things like transcranial direct current stimulation, which is used routinely in the community in community samples. It's FDA approved. And we believe that may be one treatment that we would like to study and see if that can help meaningfully change things, especially if it's done in conjunction with treatment. I've been approached by a variety of different psychiatric groups that have said they'd be interested in testing medicines, for psychopaths and seeing whether or not those medicines might work and how might we go about doing that. That's harder to do because the medicines, they might have a neurotropic effect. And if you combine them with a cognitive-based therapy at the same time, then hopefully we would see, positive outcomes and changes. But there are just certain rules that are difficult to get some of those things, implemented for good reasons. And might they be, potentially, valuable? Yeah. So I do think so. But right now, I think we have one treatment program we know works. I'd love to see it generalized or replicated in other states. I'd love to see it generalized to younger adults. So right now they're like 15, 16, 17. It'd be great to try it with 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and see if you can change them as well. And maybe it'll take a little longer because they're a little older, a little more set in their ways, if you will. But I do think that there's a lot of potential translational value to the imaging science. And I certainly hope that your audience understands that just because we see these brain predictors, that doesn't mean you can't change them. It doesn't at all.
It does give a sense of not free will, but that's not the full picture. That's not the right extrapolation. But the one that's screaming out to me that I'm curious that you didn't mention there is psychedelics. Sort of psychedelic therapy. So it's sort of, light bulbs are going off, and like in terms of if we want to give people compassion and empathy, like that could be that's one route that seems highly effective in typical people in giving them compassion and empathy and really rewiring the brain and having long-term effects on brain wiring is psychedelic therapy. But I'm curious, is there work done on psychedelics for psychopaths?
None that I know of. I mean,
really?
the difficulty, the challenge is that we're not allowed under the current ethical guidelines for research with prisoners. That's called the Office of Human Research Protections, OHRP. It currently prohibits, by statute, federal statute, any experimental drug treatment in prisoners. So if the psychopaths were in the community, some sort of non-incarcerated sample, then you might get permission to do a treatment program like that. But to do it while they're incarcerated is likely to be challenging.
I could imagine.
Ethically, I know. What's interesting though is at this point you might say, well, listen, and there have been pushes again. There have been groups and American Psychiatric Association and other groups have said, if we want to make meaningful progress, we should try to do treatment trials, and we should just have an external monitor that monitors for adverse events and other things. And it certainly has to be, voluntary, and it certainly has to be these things. But given the advances, in the last 100 years, of psychiatric treatment, maybe psychedelics is one to start with, that why wouldn't we want to give people who wanted to take these treatments an opportunity to do this and then to monitor and follow them, et cetera. So, I would be amenable to doing those types of studies and trying to understand how the brain changes with those treatments. It's just a very big hurdle to get over, and you have to have a lot of safety things in place, more than you would normally do in order to try to affect,
that makes sense.
to implement it.
The logistical issues, I'm sure, I'm kind of disregarding the logistical issues, but like if you did put them, the Mount Everest of logistical problems of giving incarcerated serial killers psychedelics, if you just push that to the side for a second, it does theoretically, seem like a really good treatment for them, because there's almost no better way, I think, that we've seen in terms of having global rewiring and change of brain in terms of behavior, in terms of thought patterns, in terms of helping them rethink things that, negative thought patterns they might have. Just like on so many levels, psychedelics seems like the right treatment, but I agree, logistically very hard and complicated for everyone involved.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's not that challenging of a. I mean, it could be done. It just takes a system that wants to be progressive and do it first, and and do it to put together kind of an ethical board and framework of people that would be antagonistic to it, and then to say like, this is our plan. How would you want us to implement this so that it was considered to be ethical and safe and fair? But the population really only exists within this incarcerated sample.
Yeah.
You just don't find it's I think it would be literally impossible to try to do this treatment in a community because they just won't show up for treatment, and so then it really only works because of where they are, and that they're accessible. I think that I would be happy to participate in discussions and processes, and what I really can share with you is that when the researchers come to them and we're independent from corrections, there's no downside to saying no, if they don't want to do anything, but they're happy to, when they're free to make those choices, even in a system, in a correctional system, the inmates really do enjoy the research. They really do enjoy participating. They often, we had one warden who did an analysis and showed that the men that volunteered for treatment and research that we were doing had less institutional infractions than the population that didn't volunteer. And he was like, so what I'm seeing is that the research has a very positive effect on the facility, giving them something, positive to go do that they enjoy, that they want to go do is seen as a good thing. And I think if you implemented the right framework and the right, the scaffolding around doing a treatment program like that with psychedelics or whatever medicines might work, I do think it could be done ethically and it could be done well. It's just going to take, it would be a bit of a challenge to try to do that. But I think it should be done. I think that that's a way to try to make meaningful progress. And it doesn't have to be in the ultra highest risk guys too. It can just be in those that are in the higher range, but are likely to get released.
Exactly.
And so then you might want to see how they're going to behave, study how they're going to behave. And I can tell you that I think most of them would volunteer for the treatment. They're, whether or not it's a wait list control or a randomized clinical trial with different types of medicines, I know that they would probably be interested in trying.
Sure, to help be sitting in their cell all day to get
that's the challenge, is that
for a day.
Yeah. And that's one of the challenges, is that it's that sitting in their cell and that kind of stuff does not allow them to have the same amount of free choice to participate as somebody who's in the community who can just never respond to the question. And so how do you balance that autonomy and that ability there? So again, I think that I think it can be managed, especially if you implement it carefully without them feeling like they have to participate. But there are people that differ in that opinion, and so then it just comes down to how do you, how might the rules change to try to allow that kind of work. And so
my absolutely no data to support this guess would be that if you wanted to reduce reoffending the absolute most, what you would do is MDMA trauma therapy and try tackle that really deep trauma that seems to be so correlated in cases of psychopaths, something that happened in their childhood, sexual abuse, violent abuse. If you tried to go to the very core of the emotional issues with MDMA in a sequence of trials again and again, I have to believe that would be highly effective. Now, expensive, maybe controversial, I don't know. Again, lots of logistical issues, but that seems like the right way to do it if you're really trying to cure these people.
Yeah, and I guess I'll share with you that, we've published many papers on this type of work, and there's absolutely no doubt that offenders generally experience way more trauma, polytrauma, both environmental based stuff. So living in neighborhoods and places that they see a lot of bad things happen, and it causes significant distress, to the interpersonal side of trauma where they're having parents or bad events happen to them, etc. It's environmental trauma that appears to be most related to psychopathic traits. We don't tend to see that the factor one traits, the interpersonal and affective traits, appear to be driven by trauma data. So that's kind of, in an interesting, thing. So it seems to be, but nevertheless, the trauma is present in every single forensic person that I've ever worked with would benefit from some form of trauma-based therapy, would benefit from that. And whether or not it's caused internalizing problems, meaning depression or anxiety, or maybe the trauma has pushed people towards more the externalizing spectrum, either way that it goes, I think that they would benefit from trauma therapy. And so that is certainly part of the therapies that people are provided in prisons, but I think it could be done at a much wider level.
Right.
And you would see benefits. And there are other things that we can learn from the trauma-based work, is that it's usually not in the inmate's best interest to be put back into the same zip code, the same environment that they came from. If it's a high risk thing, they need to be put in places that maybe they're more rural, or maybe they're places that not necessarily in the city, where they have these bad experiences, but be put someplace that's safer, because that's an easy thing to remove. The environmental side of it is easy to not put them back in the same place. Well, I think it's easier, I don't actually do that work, but that is the type of, I definitely agree with you. And currently I think that everyone in the prison would benefit from trauma therapy. We currently still don't understand whether there's this theory that there's two types of psychopaths. One is the primary. They come from biology and genetics, and they're just immutable, and they're going to be like that way no matter what. And then there's the secondary psychopathic pathway, which is supposed to be more from a trauma-based thing that kind of has developed or suppressed the development of these limbic circuits, and then the behaviors manifest and they score high on psychopathy. In the best studies that I've seen, and we've contributed a bit to this, is kind of going to be like a 70-30 split. So 70% of the population is primary and 30% is secondary. Although that's it's difficult to come up with how to define,
but
their
trauma would likely be a case in both of these. It's just, explain maybe the difference, because if there's environmental trauma primarily in both, right?
So there could be. The point is that there's two. The point is that some people believe there's two groups of psychopaths. One that is primarily driven by biology, and trauma could have happened or not. And then the other one is driven by, the environment, and that's the so-called secondary. And the secondary is typically differentiated from the primary through anxiety. So it would be an individual. So the primaries have low anxiety. They have basically very little concern or worry, and they're a low anxious individual, versus somebody who has all of the traits but is more high anxious. And there's a variety of ways people have tried to assess anxiety, but when you try to break it up, high, low, anxious, however you try to come up with a split of those that score really high, it's kind of a 70-30 or even 80-20, so that the secondary is more in the minority. And what that means is that one way to interpret that data would say is that it's hard to make somebody get these traits. It has to be a long, prolonged, chronic, kind of, trauma or bad environment or environment conducive to the development of these traits. And that leads, in a small minority of individuals to the development of these traits and the expression of these traits in all domains of their life. You might also argue that the secondary, it depends on when the trauma and other things occurred, I guess, but that there would be the ability to differentiate them early in life. They would have different trajectories, and then it would be some events that have set them on this other path. And we're working to do that. This work is difficult to do because it's hard to get really good family history data. It's hard for inmates to admit to, traumas, especially sexual abuse, or something that people would think is particularly.
That's what the MDMA
damaging.
for is, right? Like that's what MDMA would hopefully uncover.
No, I get it. I totally understand. And so I think that these are great. They're great questions. If you're sensing any hesitancy in my voice, it's simply because it's really a challenge to try to get permission to
For
do
sure.
those
I
studies. And
accept that.
so,
Is
yeah,
there a
but
cultural, do you think there's still even a cultural stigma to wanting to try cure these people? Because people, there's a general maybe idea that like they committed a crime, they deserve to rot in a hole. Is that, do you think there's still a bit of a culture of that?
oh, absolutely. I mean, I see that. I think you see that kind of consequentialist perspective. That kind of uh, there's another term for it. I'm blanking on right now. But the um, the tit for tat. That if you did something bad, then you need to
Right.
go, and spend the time. And certainly retributivist philosophy. That's the word. In a retributivist society, America definitely wins in all of educated countries. We incarcerate more per capita than anybody else. We have the longest sentences. We have mandatory minimums. I mean, we put people in jail for 3 or 4, 500 years. Some of these sentences you can see, but the uh, so yeah, so I think that there still is that philosophy, and that's again one of the reasons why the Mendota program started with youth, is because there's a very big difference between juvenile corrections and adult corrections. Juvenile corrections, there's a complete emphasis, as rightfully so, on remediation and treatment and trying to curb them from being there. So I think the best thing to do is to really start with people when they're young, 12
Yes.
to 18. But I have by no means given up hope for the 18 to 25-year-olds, to treat them first time adult offenders and try to get them through programs like Mendota, and into other types of treatment programs to try to see them change. And I think that we have to talk about, I mean, most of the guys that we work with in New Mexico and in other states, they're there for reasons that aren't related to psychopathy. They're there for substance use, or they're environmental or social or economic, and they were committing crimes to support themselves, or they're in the drug trade. Most of them are using or abusing drugs. And if you take a more European or other philosophies about decriminalization, not eliminating um, sentences and stuff like that, but basically provide a lot more community-based treatments, a lot more community-based programs like methadone clinics, like places like that allow people to get treatment, ideally free of stigma, free of
Yes.
labeling and other types of things, that you will see a reduction in those poor outcomes. And if you do those things, I think you could reduce the prison population by 50% in the U.S.
Right.
Because most of them are nonviolent offenders. Most of them are doing drugs or other things that if you were to minimize the sentences or put them into places where they get treatment and housing, but are able to go out and work. So even like, work farms, workplaces, massively increase those versus prisons, or make that a new division of the Department of Corrections and shift resources and do risk assessments and put guys. I mean, we have these road crews, they're called, most of the prisons are sparse, pretty far outside of major metropolitan areas in New Mexico, 5, 6, 7 hours, some of them. And what they do is they have road crews that will go out under supervision, of course, and they will, for inmates, will go out and they'll clean up trash. They'll repair, do small repairs to freeways and highways and stuff like that, especially rural places. And they have a great track record of, you know, uh, that being successful. And I think the other thing to do is to give them skills, to train them in the facilities for certain skills, to give them options for learning certain skills, whether that's like being a mechanic, which they all like to do, or some other type of skill that is adaptive and available for them on the outside. And then to help them with placements, to supplement, places that help them, take them in and work with them. That's a huge way to overall reduce the effect of crime.
Yes.
But my lab and this general conversation is dealing with the top 15, 20%. And they certainly need different forms of management and certain forms of treatment and certain forms of problems. And so that we've kind of, to get to kind of general conversation, but my lab is really, known for focusing on the ultimate highest risk guys and how you might try to remediate them.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, it's such a tough problem because while MDMA treatment might be effective, I can completely understand there being a bit of outrage there on if someone goes and murders a bunch of people and then the victims' families are hearing that they're getting fed MDMA and having parties in prison. Like I could totally understand why that's like hard to wrap your head around and very culturally weird and maybe very progressive and very just different to typical, but it could just be incredibly effective. But this has been such a fun conversation. I think your work is insanely interesting, and you're such a great communicator with how you talk about it. And I love the way we've been able to go to the protocols and really talk about how practical this is and what the actual results of this is, which is just amazing. We're nearing on 2 hours, which is crazy. I am. What are you really excited about in like next 10 years of either protocols for treating psychopathy or neuro advancements in technology and reading their brains better, just anything in this psychopathy space, like what's being developed at the moment, what research is being done, what's incredibly exciting for you?
Yeah, so we're currently just implemented the first ever randomized clinical trial for psychopathic traits that's ever been funded by NIH. And
Cool.
so it's a attention and cognitive based treatment that tries to remediate those deficits specifically. And we're scanning and studying how the brain changes over time with treatment. And so I'm really encouraged by that. I'm also really encouraged by recent developments in AI therapeutics. So basically, it's called Therabot. The first paper too was published by some folks at Dartmouth University. And the idea here is that to be able to give inmates as much therapy as they're interested in, but do it in a way that's fun and engaging, and they can do it when they want, meaning that they can go online, and they all have iPads now, or tablets, and they would be able to go online and participate in treatment and therapy with a an AI based agent that's
Right.
very rigorous.
Makes sense.
And you might be able to actually get them forms of cognitive treatment to the masses. So instead of me treating 300 offenders over and cognitive based treatments over 4 years, I'd be able to treat 3,000 every week, or 10,000. I mean, New Mexico used to have about 10,000 inmates. We're about 6 right now, and you could literally give every one of them, an option to participate in the treatment, to give them these positive reinforcement things if they do the treatment. You can watch them, make sure that they're doing the treatment program right. You can engage with them. There can be snippets and things that are done. You can collect what's called ecologically valid or ecologically following momentary assessment. So you can ping them during the day and other times when they're with their pad to find out how they're feeling, how they're thinking, and whether or not they might benefit from a booster shot right now. To be able to try to maintain those things in the community with current technology, to try to get them to be able to call and talk or do a Therabot at night, every night before they go to bed. Maybe it's almost like a guided, if it's mindfulness, you might do a guided thing. I mean, and to allow them to try to help them as best we possibly can. But that has to be on top of the basic things: giving them a place to live, giving them 3 square meals on the outside, giving them a job on the outside, giving them something that will help manage them and monitor them and make sure that you're giving them the resources that they need to not misbehave is way more cost effective than chasing them down, and conflict with them after they've been released with police and other law enforcement. So I think that there's a lot of promise that we're going to be able to do new treatments and do them in larger populations. From the neuroscience perspective, I mean, I'm really excited about advances in quantifying mild traumatic brain injury. Most of our inmates have had a bonk on the head at some point. Most have some sort of scar tissue in there. Learning how to understand how that can also be treated, measured, quantified, and treated is really, I think, of interest to me. It's a fun problem because it can happen anywhere in the brain. So you're dealing with a very different math, very different problem than the other things that we normally deal with, because brain injury can happen anywhere. And so those are some of the things. And in psychopathy, I think that, I'd love to see us continue to develop the best assessment procedure. So to maybe test some new items, test some different scoring criteria for psychopathy, test some different other metrics to try to help capture the variants maybe that the brain scans are capturing, and so the risk assessments can be even better and more helpful. Maybe try to make it a little faster. Most clinicians say it takes too long. It's expensive to do because it takes hours of time. And so see if there's a way to use AI to help, get a score faster.
Right.
Summaries of thousands of pages of medical records and other records. You could do that more quickly with more technology today. Those are just some of the things that I'd like to work on to help improve it. A total goal would be to have MJTC implemented in a half a dozen states, and to to have those states see the benefits, and then to see a lot more people moving towards this rehabilitative model in kids, that would be great. One of the reasons why I wrote my pop psych book was the Psychopath Whisperer, was because there was a potential solution to the problem, right? That there was
Right.
an opportunity to highlight that the first ever truly therapy designed to help work with these high risk youth was effective. I mean, it's like the first time in history that somebody ever started from scratch and said, let's try to treat these kids with a new contemporary, taking all of the positive things that we've learned about, cognitive based treatments, and putting them into a program that could help achieve these types of outcomes. And then it works, and then they publish it, and then they, I've been one of their biggest advocates, going around telling everybody about it. It drives them nuts because I got all these phone calls and stuff after I give a talk somewhere about it. But the point is that I just can't tell good enough things about that program.
Right.
And so I just really would love to see that go forward.
Awesome.
And the other stuff too, we've already touched on them. I think that it would be great to be able to do clinical trials with medicines. I think it would be great to do TMS. I think it would be, great to try, other treatment modalities. And, we're all for it. Our scanners are busy. They're being used a lot. I would love to go do a specialized population. Like for years, I've kind of dreamt about going to San Quentin and scanning everybody on death row in California, all 755 men. And then really trying to see, the definitive, that's probably the place on the planet that has the most numbers of ultra high risk guys.
Right.
And seeing, does our work generalize, does the effects we see in the brain happen in there too, or some other facility like that would just be, the kind of research that I've really wanted to go do.
Fascinating.
But we're on the cusp of we have everybody in longitudinal studies, so we're tracking and following and studying, and we continue to develop new analytical techniques to examine outcomes and stuff. And I think there's a lot more really exciting stuff that we can do. So I'm very enthusiastic, and these podcasts are great to just kind of refresh and ruminate and think about it, and share those things with everybody. So it's an exciting time.
It's been such a pleasure. I've loved being able to tell even a tiny part of your story. You're an amazing communicator, and your work.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So important. I've so many more questions here. We didn't get to Neurolaw. I wanted to dive into the Brian Duggan case. There's so much more. I'd love to have you back. Love to have you back for round two. But
sure. Let's really do part two.
Yeah, it's been such a pleasure. Honestly, I'll leave all the links down below, all of the protocols, treatment programs. Okay. Psychopath Whisperers is a fantastic book. I really do recommend people pick it up. I'm already excited for our round two, Kent. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you.
Pleasure.
Stick a psychopath in a brain scanner. What are some of the things that you'll see?
You'll notice decreased activities in parts of the brain involved in decision making and emotional reactions. Several different parts of the frontal lobe, which is involved in executive functioning, foreseeing future events, the future consequences. Decreased volume of brain tissue in those areas, an inability to really feel, to get reward from things that you and I might get rewards from, good movie, friendship, etc. There might be a need to get some kind of stimulus so they can feel. To do that, they may have to do some extreme behaviors in order to get some kind of emotional response.
What triggered it all? I wish I could give you a good straightforward answer around that.
This stereotype of psychopaths making up a large proportion of government, high-powered executives, CEOs, is that a myth or is there truth to that?